What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the NBA Optimizer tutorial here. Joined here, good buddy, Caleb, architect of the Optimizer. How you doing, Caleb?
Doing well, man. Doing well. Crazy NBA's here already, but ready to get after it.
Yeah, I'm so pumped about having this Optimizer. I'm somebody who's historically just been single entry, maybe 3 entry, and I've been MMEing throughout the NFL season so far with a lot of success. Definitely thanks in large part, if not fully thanks to this Optimizer. So given how friendly the NBA DFS landscape is for optimizers, I just can't wait to get going in this season.
Absolutely.
All right, let's jump right in here and let's talk about what makes this Optimizer kind of, our new darling. And it's these presets. So let's start here. Talk to us about what the presets are and specifically how they relate to bracketed ownership.
Yeah, so the presets, what that does is it takes all the contest data from the specific slate size that you're on. So in this case, a 2-gamer for the opening night, looks at the winners from, previous 20 to 40 different contests throughout the years, and basically just takes all the nuggets that winning users kind of do differently, how they separate themselves and what makes winners winners, and takes that data, takes that information, and directly plugs it into the Optimizer.
You can really easily access this, by the way. You just hit this use presets button, and then all of a sudden, all of this bracketed ownership stuff will immediately fill in specific to that slate. So I think the key thing for me with these presets are to know the fact that this isn't just like what we think is optimal. This is a data-driven approach, figuring out what the winning strategies have been in the past, and then applying them to future slates, size specific, totals specific. Like it's very, very specific to each slate. So super data-driven approach, something I obviously really enjoy.
And it's so much better for NBA. I don't want to say better necessarily, but for NFL, the lines are so blurred between like a 13-game slate and a 12-game slate. It is different, but it's not crazy different. Whereas like a 2-game slate for NBA is so much different than a huge 10-gamer. So I think that's where the presets really, really come in handy for that.
And where you see that immediately in this 2-game slate is it's not asking for any players to be under 2.5% owned or under 5% owned or under 10% owned, because we know ownership is going to be so concentrated. And with NBA, it's so much more predictable from a player-to-player standpoint that anyone under 10% on a 2-game slate, probably a really low probability play. So that's why we see this. On larger slates, that might look something like, between 1 and 2 players under 2.5%, between 1 and 3 players under 5%, something like that. And then, kind of extend that throughout the rest. But obviously, that's not this opening slate when we only have 2 games. But one other thing I want to point to here is we also down here have this total ownership range. And this is typically going to be pretty wide, because when you talk about total ownership, what you're talking about is staying under a certain threshold of chalk and making sure you have enough differentiation within your lineups. I think the bracketed ownership really takes care of that fact more than anything else, and more effectively than anything else. And it gets to the point that I made a ton on shows last year, which is, when we have a 50% value play in NBA, it's never to me about whether that's too high or too low for the player. It's in what kinds of lineups do I want to use this guy? Do I have a 5% guy that I think can break the slate, where it's then much easier to take on that ownership? The bracketed ownership presets takes care of all of that for us. You don't even then have to think any harder on that, right? You can just say, yeah, I'm okay with using this 50% guy. I'm okay with not using him. Do what you will, Optimizer, and just let it go from there.
Yeah, and especially NBA, right? I mean, even this year already with NFL, we've got like Mostert at 50+%. A-Chain was touching that. But I mean, for NBA, it's every single night you'll have people touching 90%. And, it's the age-old question, like, oh, you don't want a 90% person in your lineup. Some people might think that immediately, but like that's completely viable for NBA. Like you just said, you just want to blend it in with some other low-end plays to give you that differentiation.
Let's also talk about two other things here. There's randomness. So we get randomness in the point projections and also the ownership projections. And then we also have the ceiling projections blend. I bring these together. I want to talk about them together because they're both questions that we get a lot. You know, how much ceiling blend should I use in MME? How much randomness should I use in a 20 entry contest? And I think for both of them, the answer isn't that, I should say there's no right answer for everybody. It's about what you do specifically. In particular, it's about how you are kind of achieving the player pool that you want. Are you somebody who uses min exposure if you want to get more of a contrarian stud, or are you somebody who will then go in and boost the projections? If you're boosting projections, if you're very meticulously setting projections to your own liking, you don't want randomness because you want the optimizer to be able to follow specifically the projections that you have set. Similarly, you don't want to then blend in ceilings because you can't edit the ceilings. You can only edit the baseline projection. So if you want the optimizer to follow exactly what you're doing with those projections, you don't want to add randomness. You don't want to add ceiling. How do you approach this? Do you like the min exposure route, or do you like adjusting projections?
I usually go the min-max exposure route. I mean, I kind of wrote I know it's not true for everyone, but I kind of wrote the code of the optimizer to handle that in a way that I like. So I'm very comfortable using min-max exposure. And with that being said, I usually leave randomness at around medium. But like you said, it's very much driven by the user and how the user performs it.
And I think it makes perfect sense if you're using the min and max exposures to kind of tailor your player pool. You want more randomness because that will then also help the optimizer achieve what you're asking it to achieve. The only other thing I'd say here is, we have now proven we do have the best ownership projections around the industry in all sports. So in that regard, I don't necessarily want a lot of randomness in the ownership, but it is important to know that like when we project the guy at 12.5%, we're not saying he's going to be 12.5%. We're saying he's probably going to be somewhere between 10 and 15%, or 7 and 20%, something like that. And so in that regard, I do like having a little bit of projected ownership, particularly when these bracketed ownerships might look something like this, where if it's set like this, for example, and there's a guy that the optimizer really likes that's at 7%. It helps for some of the lineups for his projected ownership to be under 5% for him to qualify as this guy here. So that's the way that I use randomness on the projected ownership. So I will leave some of that regardless of whether or not I have changed the actual point projections or not.
Yeah, exactly. Like you don't want someone projected at 5.1% to always be above that threshold of that under 5%. You want them, someone at 5.1%, we're saying pretty much equally is going to be under 5% and over 5%.
100%. All right. Obviously, there's not as much to do with stacking in the NBA as the NFL, but talk to us a little bit about this page. What are you looking to accomplish here, and how does it change from one slate to the next?
Yeah, so we got some plans to revamp this a little bit. I'll say that up front, but right off the bat, usually like this is just I use this just to limit the total number of players on a given team. Right, there's only so much fantasy goodness to go around with NBA. It's kind of like unlike NFL, we have locked number of minutes, relatively locked number of like total points. So you don't want to jam in all 8 players from the same team. So generally, I'll spend some time with this to kind of limit the total number of players on a given team. And sometimes to limit the total salary. So like, for example, to say, I'm okay having up to 4 players from one team, but I don't want all 4 of those players to be, 10K studs.
Yeah. So in fact, we've set up something here to use as an example with the Lakers. Now, this probably isn't applicable to opening night since it's only a 2-game slate, but pretend for a second this was a larger slate. You really like the Lakers, but you don't want to have both of LeBron James and Anthony Davis. What you can do is you can say, okay, I'm okay with having a maximum of 2 Lakers, but then you go to the player groups and you set, I called this one the LAL studs. You got both LeBron and Anthony Davis in here, between 0 and 1 of them in 100% of lineups. So this will guarantee that you never have both of them. It doesn't guarantee that you have one of them in every lineup because you have a min of 0, but this accomplishes that. You can also do this, by the way, as you just said, in the total salary. So they combine for what on this opening slate?
Like 17K, 18K, or
yeah, something like that. So you could just go in here and you could say, I don't want more than 1,700. And now you're not, or 17,000. Now you're not going to get both LeBron and Anthony Davis in the lineup together that way. So lots of different ways that you can accomplish this. I think the thing that I would say that has been most impressive to me about this optimizer in NFL as well and MLB is that so often you go to the groups, you think you have to create a player group for something, and then you realize, wait a minute, I can just do this in a much easier step in the team stack section or the build setting, something like that. So if you're somebody who's building a million groups, just know you might be missing something in the team stack section, in the build settings, whatever, that could really save you a lot of time on a nightly basis. Mm-hmm. Now, we obviously do have some instances where we want to have groups. So we created this one for the Phoenix Studs. Talk us through what's going on with this big group where we are using a double anchor with both Kevin Durant and Devin Booker, and then including Steph and Chris Paul.
Yeah, so this is just an example of how you might use anchors in groups. Mm-hmm. And basically the idea of anchors is that the group only applies if all the anchored players are in that lineup. So in this case, we're saying, and this might not be the best example on like a two game slate, but think of this maybe for a bigger slate. Yeah. We're basically saying, I'm okay having Kevin Durant and Devin Booker in the same lineup, but if both those players are going to hit at that high of a salary, we're kind of expecting it to be a high-paced game, up-tempo. Mm-hmm. That means Golden State, the opposing team, is going to be firing away as well. So if these two studs, these high-salary players are in the lineup, we want to bring it back with another stud from the opposing team.
Yeah. Yeah, and the way you can read this specifically, if this whole anchor thing is a little bit confusing to you, the anchor is the if portion of an if-then statement, and then the rest is the then. So this would read as if both Durant and Booker, then between 3 and 4 of all of these guys. So you're basically saying if Durant and Booker, then at least one of Steph and Chris Paul also in the lineup. And yeah, that's for the shootout game environment. It's also for the 6% chance of whatever it is that the game goes to overtime and you get an extra 5 minutes for everybody. It's basically just saying if I'm using both of these guys together, make it an entire game stack. Really straightforward philosophy there. And where it can also be used too, like on other slates, or maybe on this slate, like you're worried that, hey, I really love Jokic tonight, but I'm worried that they blow them out. So if I've got Jokic, I want at least one of his opponent. So because I know that team is going to have to score more than they're expected to score. So at least one of their guys is likely to go off. So I want to have a mix and match of all of their opponents.
Exactly.
Lots of different ways you can
blowouts. Yep. No, that's a great point. Yep. Mm-hmm. And also just really quick too, just thinking about this, like NBA, like so much of the leverage you get, so much of your ROI is like how you understand injury news. Yep. So a good way to use it too is like, let's say if you have, this is for a bigger slate, for example, but like Jokic at 10K on the very last slate, if he's questionable, mm-hmm. you might want to like min or max one Jokic with another center that's at like 9.9K so mm-hmm. that it'll be an easy swap if it does turn out that Jokic is out.
100%. Yeah. And that's something that Fantasy Guru Drew, who hit, I think like 3 or 4 100K winners last season, has talked about a bunch in the past. So love that point as well.
Yeah. Drew and I were going back. I think we had like 5 or 6 100K binks between us in the month of January. We were
going back. It was absolutely nuts. Anything else before we call it a day here?
I'm going to go to the build settings really, really quick. Mm-hmm. If we go back there, just want to shout out one feature that we just recently put in. At the very bottom left, we have a min minutes feature. Yep. And that's just to, if you want, you can just put in like, for example, 15. That'll filter out any player that's below 15 minutes.
Beautiful.
So yeah, if you just want to get rid of all the kind of low projected players, mm-hmm. do that. You won't get any of the lower projected players, and the optimizer will also just run a little bit faster because it's a smaller pool.
Yeah. Last thing here, let's go to the player table and let's talk about the ability to edit user minutes and user projections. So where do you want to start here? Talk about user minutes first?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. All right. So imagine that you think, let's go down here. One of my favorite guys on this opening slate, I think, is Chris Paul. And we'll see what his ownership is going to be. I've got him projected pretty popular. I was hoping that he would be more contrarian than he is. Obviously, this $5,600 price tag is inviting to more than just myself. But let's say you think this $27.8 minute projection is low on him. You think there's no way that Chris Paul isn't going to play at least 30 minutes. You put in 30 and watch what happens to this 28.09 projection. It automatically adjusts up to 30.3, keeping the point per minute, fantasy point per minute, I should say, ratio intact. So whatever that ratio is to begin with, whatever we have it projected as, that will carry over to any minute projection that you change.
Yep. And this is key towards, the right, kind of the beginning of the slate when there's all the crazy injury news. This is very key to hone in your projections. Obviously, FTN is on top of things, and projections is some of the best in the industry, but there can always be, just even like a few second delay in NBA is huge. So you want to be able to stay on top of that.
Yeah, and new this year, we should mention that the optimizer is now fed directly from our FTN data API. So all lineup changes will be reflected automatically. We no longer have to manually update that, push an update. We do still have to manually update the ownership. So you might see like, let's say, Steph was all of a sudden ruled out and now Chris Paul is expected to play 35 minutes. He's going to be really popular. His minute projection, his fantasy points per minute, all of those will update automatically. I will then have to still go in and change the projected ownership. So there are going to be nights where, it's 6:45, news broke, the lineups will change. I won't be able to push a final projected ownership, but obviously you would know, hey, Chris Paul is suddenly not going to be 51.9%. He's going to be 80%. And you can then go do that yourself. And, if it's a case of Draymond, who's I've got him projected almost at 0 because we think he might not play. So that's basically just a wash for right now. If all of a sudden he was announced in and, Kevon Looney was ruled out, we don't want the presets to consider him as a less than 2.5% ownership guy. So you could come in here, you could put him at 25, and now it's going to follow all the rules correctly with Draymond Green. Final point here. Let's say you didn't want to bother with the user minutes. You just want to say, I don't want him projected at 28.1. I want him projected at 31 points. You put that there. Notice it will tell you the fantasy point per minute difference, but the user projection is going to overrule everything else. So if you now go in and say, I think he's going to score more because he's going to play more, and you go to 30 minutes here, the projection is not going to change. It's going to update the fantasy points per minute just to let you know, okay, this is what you've now set him at, right? So if, let's say you said, I only think he's going to play 25 minutes, but I think he's going to be at 33 fantasy points. Now you can see, okay, do I really think it's fair to put Chris Paul at 1.32 fantasy points per minute? Maybe not. Maybe that's too high. So you can adjust this in whichever way you want. But if you've got something in this user projection box, that will overrule everything else. That's what the optimizer is going to treat as his projection.
Absolutely. Yep. Great.
Anything else here that you want to touch on?
Yes. Yeah. Last thing I want to touch on really quick is that I use the boost feature pretty heavily for NBA, because unlike NFL, like I said, you get so many late breaking news, and sometimes it can just be a pain if you're overriding so many different user minutes, user projections, and then everything changes last second. It can be hard to untangle everything. So if you know that you like a player, a lot of times I will just boost them in that column to the right. So then I know I don't I don't know. What's a good example? Klay Thompson, I don't know what his minutes are going to be necessarily with Draymond Green in or out. So I'll just boost him, say that I like him. That way I don't need to, change any other minutes or anything like that.
Yeah. And so the nice thing there is it remains dynamic, right? So if something happens with Draymond Green, if Draymond's ruled out and all of a sudden we boost Klay's projected minutes from 34.2 to 36 and his projected points from 29.3 to 31.3, having him boosted will now still allow him to have a higher projection, and now you're still boosting him on top of that. Whereas if you had changed his projection, if you had put this in at 31, and now we all of a sudden boost his projection to 31.3, that's not going to be reflected. It's still going to take what you took. Final note there is, anytime you want to get rid of what you have done and just default back to what we have, all you have to do is clear that box and everything will fall back to exactly what we have. Really nice feature there as well.
Yep.
When you do boost a guy, how severely do you do it? Because as people can see here, there are 5 different levels of the boost, both up and down. Typically, are you going up just 1? Are you going up 3, 5? Does it just depend on the player or what?
I'm not going up more than 2 usually, because at that point, like that's like a 10% change, 10% boost. Each one is 5%. And it's like if you're going up by more than 10%, then like there's something that needs changing, like in the projections themselves and the underlying projections. And I would want to change a lot more than just that one player. So unless it's like, last second and I just need to like bomb someone down, bomb someone up, I'm only typically doing 2.
All right. Just as a bonus here, opening night slate. I don't know if you've looked at it at all. Who's your GPP winner?
Oh man, what I think I was seeing like Steph's only like 12%, right? Yeah, Steph's at like 12%. As a Blazer fans, like I'm not the biggest Warriors fan, but so the fact that I like Steph is probably pretty telling. Yeah, I don't know. I gotta say Steph, or I like the Chris Paul play too. I know he's not like low owned, but man, you gotta play him when he's still getting 30 minutes or so, because that's probably not gonna be the case the entire season.
Yeah. On the First Look show with Zach the other day, I said my GPP winner was going to be one of the new guys. So Beal, Nurkic, and Chris Paul all on new teams. I was pretty confident that somebody in that group was going to be really under-owned. Doesn't seem like that's the case, so I might have to reevaluate. We've got a few days to do that. Are we all done here? You think we covered it all?
Yeah, yep, think we covered it all.
Awesome. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in. It's going to be a fantastic season. Let's all have a good one, and go Phillies. And also good luck to us all in the NFL slate this upcoming weekend.